Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our next in the series that we have, SIECUS Online. We are going to begin right at 7:05. We had quite a high number of registrants, and so we want to make sure that we give folks a little bit of time to join us. But we are excited to have this conversation. I am loving this participant number ticking up, so it looks like we are going to have an awesome turnout and are so excited for all of you to be here with us. So just hang tight. We're going to wait until 7:05 and then we'll begin the conversation. Last time we got a lot of commentary of where folks were coming from, so feel free to shout outs to who's hailing from where. And look at that already. Yeah, Michigan, Montreal. I love getting the international perspective on here. This is excellent. Yeah. Yes, Valerie, eat your dinner. Everyone take care of themselves. Also, apologies for any background noise. We are starting right at bedtime. We are going to have to do a we're going to have to capture this to see how international our reach is on this conversation. So exciting to see folks. Ireland, I saw Barbados. This is awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Vancouver, I love it. God, Vancouver is so beautiful. In my Bay Area folks, I hope that you are doing well. My gosh, all of our friends on the West Coast who are here, thank you. I know that you are going through some just real difficulty and tragedy right now. So just sending all of our well wishes and hopes that the weather shifts and these fires get under control. Hawaii, love it. Yeah, Louisiana as well. Man, there's a lot going on. Australia. So about 2 more minutes just to make sure that we've got everyone who wants to join us available and able to log on. But this is exciting. I'm so pleased by how many folks are joining us this evening. And I hope that some of you are repeats from the conversation that we held in July on sexual citizens. In some ways, I think that this conversation, ties in really nicely to the conversation that we were having on strategies for recognizing and addressing sexual assault on college campuses. And so I'm pleased by the common thread that we're holding and really in recognizing and uplifting some of the ways and exploring further some of the ways that providing positive affirmative sex education is a factor in helping to create safer environments for all of us. Yay. Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that, Heidi. Blue skies today. 2 days of clean air after a month of smoke in the Bay Area. Great. Take some deep breaths. All right, it's 7:05. We are ready to rock and roll. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us today. We're having another really important conversation in this series, SIECUS Online. I am so glad that you are all here. And we definitely have another full house tonight, which is also additionally so wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Again, our goal is to, have a conversation with some of these incredible experts that I've got on the Zoom with me, and then to make sure that we've got plenty of time for Q&A from the audience. So once again, I'm Chris Harley, the President and CEO of SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change. SIECUS was founded in 1964 to be the leading voice for shame-free education on human sexuality and a champion for sexual and reproductive freedom as an essential part of the human experience. SIECUS asserts that sex education is a powerful vehicle for social change, and we're the only national organization that's solely focused on advancing the rights of all people to accurate information, comprehensive sex education, in the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health services. At SIECUS, we believe that sex ed can spark social change at the nexus of many important social justice movements, from racial justice and LGBTQ rights to the Me Too movement and other urgent conversations that we need to have around consent and healthy relationships. I want to welcome you to, this is our newest program offering. It's called SIECUS Online, recently branded. And this is a series of virtual armchair discussions that is sponsored by BVibe that explore sex education as a vehicle for social change with leading experts in the field. BVibe's core mission is to empower exploration through education, and by offering a constant array of accessible content, carefully written guides, and real-world information, the brand promotes inclusivity and informed play. So SIECUS Online seeks to explore the latest sex ed topics with the folks who know the most about them. And we are so excited to be able to partner with BVibe, whose mission aligns so closely with ours. And I want to also just reiterate that the proceeds from SIECUS Online events go to and support all of our speakers and SIECUS's work to advance sex education across the United States. So thank you for being with us and for your support. Tonight's event is Consent, Sex Positivity, and Pleasure, Filling the Gaps in Sex Education, where we will explore some of the key barriers preventing us from teaching the type of shame-free, affirming sex education that each of us deserve. But before we begin, I'm going to go over our housekeeping items again. For those that were on the last call, they're the same ones. As you know, we are using Zoom webinar, which means that all participants are muted and video cameras are turned off. But please feel free to chat in the chat function as you've been doing per usual. This can be seen by all audience members, or you can just chat with the speakers. There's also a Q&A box that we invite you to submit your questions in. And these will be moderated by my colleague, Amy Jenkins, who will help to pool audience questions during the Q&A portion of this evening's event. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. I try to leave plenty of room so that we're able to explore and respond to them. But if we're not able to respond to your questions, just flag for us and we'll do our best to try to collect any unanswered questions and provide you with a brief response. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all of you who registered for the event. And then we will, and you might also be able to find it on our YouTube channel. As with other nonprofit organizations, this pandemic has impacted SIECUS and the support for our work. And so this event is intended as a fundraiser, as I mentioned earlier. So every once in a while you will see an invitation to go to www.siecus.org/donate to make a contribution so that we can continue this work. So with all of that out of the way, I'm now going to introduce our incredible speakers. I just want to say again how fortunate I feel to be able to be in conversation with these amazing experts, thought leaders, innovators, entrepreneurs, and leading mentors of the field. I don't think I can emphasize enough just what an incredible array of folks that are here with us tonight. And in some ways I feel I wish that we had more time to pick the amazing brains that are in this room, and so this is really just the skim the surface of the wealth of knowledge that are joining us this evening. But first, I want to introduce Dr. J. Dennis Fortenberry. He's a physician specializing in adolescent medicine with a 30-year research interest in adolescent sexuality, sexual behavior, and healthcare of sexual and gender minoritized youth, and sexually transmitted infections. He is a fellow of the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality and past president of the American STD Association and the International Academy of Sex Research. And Dr. Fortenberry received the 2019 Gold Medal for Research from the World Association of Sexual Health. Deanna Bruce is the founder of Collaborate with Deanna Bruce. For the past 25 years, Deanna has advanced health and education access and equity through school health, reproductive health, HIV/AIDS and STI prevention, sexuality education, and LGBTQ advocacy. Today, she consults with schools and organizations from across the country, but previously she served as the Director of Health and Wellness for the District of Columbia Public Schools, where she led the development of the nationally recognized transgender and gender nonconforming policy guidance and removed regulatory barriers to allow school-based health centers to dispense medication, including contraception. So for any folks who are why does it keep making noise? Who are trying to figure out how to advance these kinds of policies in your own communities, Deanna has just a wealth of information about how she was able to do that and work with other communities to do similar things. When not advising schools and organizations or parenting her children, Deanna teaches yoga, serves as the youth chair and board member of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives, and mentors women that are new in their careers through the Women's Information Network Advisory Council in DC. So very active. Melissa Pintor Carnagey is a Black and Latinx Austin-based sexuality educator, licensed social worker, and the founder of Sex Positive Families. Melissa facilitates virtual workshops, online communities, parent coaching, and develops content for families to use to tackle talks about sexual health in a shame-free, inclusive, and pleasure-positive ways. Their work has been featured in media such as the HuffPost, Mashable, and Parents Magazine. She recently collaborated with Amaze to create a digital toolkit that helps parents talk openly with their children about porn and sexually explicit media. And Melissa is also a sex-positive parent raising 3 young people ages 7, 10, and 21. And for those of you who don't know about Amaze, you should look it up. It's just a content-rich resource for parents, particularly who are looking for online content for young people at this time. And then last but not least, certainly, is Brooke Faught, who is... Yes, okay. Sorry, Jessica, yes, there will be a recording of this session made available for those who registered. So Brooke Faught is a board-certified women's health nurse practitioner with specialty training in female sexual and pelvic floor healthcare. In 2005, Brooke actually developed and implemented the Women's Institute for Sexual Health, or WISH, as a division of the Urology Associates in Nashville, Tennessee, and now functions as the director of WISH. She is a member of the International Society for the Study of Women's Sexual Health and serves as a secretary on the executive board of directors. Brooke maintains an adjunct faculty position at Vanderbilt University School of Nursing and is widely published in the field of women's sexual and pelvic health. Professional awards include the William Oxley Thompson Award for Early Career Achievement and Alumni Transformers in Nursing and Healthcare through the Ohio State University Alumni Association. She's in a recent Alumni Award for Clinical Excellence from the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, received the Nashville Business Journal 40 Under 40 Award, and also the Nashville Business Journal Women of Influence Award. So Brooke is tearing it up in Nashville. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much again. The one last thing that I just want to share for everyone joining us today is a set of definitions, some of these that we'll be exploring through this conversation. And so I'm going to ask Amy now to share those key terms with the audience in the chat box, just so that we're all operating from the same place, but includes some definitions for this conversation, and then from the sexual citizens conversation as well. So she will be adding those in there now. Great. Okay, so that was a lot. Try to talk fast so we could get to the meat of the conversation. Okay, so I'm going to start with Dennis and Brooke. As medical practitioners and researchers and just, all around sort of knowledge experts, I wanted to start with the both of you. Because both of you actually co-authored papers just in this past year that speak to the importance of sexual pleasure. Professor Fortenberry argued in Why Pleasure Matters, Its Global Relevance for Sexual Health, Sexual Rights, and Well-Being, that there is a need to prioritize sexual pleasure in law, policy, advocacy, public health, and clinical practice. And then at the same time, Brooke joined a paper, The Female Sexual Health, Barriers to Optimal Outcomes and a Roadmap for Improved Patient-Clinician Communications, that discusses some of the social taboos around sex for pleasure as being one of the barriers that contributes to female sexual disorders. So I wondered if you both could start by speaking more about these studies that you contributed to and why you felt like it was an important conversation to have, and why you're so concerned about sexual pleasure as a factor contributing to our healthcare outcomes.
I'm happy to get started. Thank you so much for having me, by the way. And for those of you that have never met me, I'm Brooke. I know that you were introduced to all of us. For me, finding out the barrier to optimal patient outcomes when you're talking about sex medicine is the foundation to being able to provide proper care to our patients. Not only are patients coming in unaware of their just basic sexual terms, what sexuality is, but oftentimes there's a huge barrier from the provider standpoint as well. Oftentimes, I know in my medical training, we had very limited exposure to sexuality education and how to address not just, STD prevention and, prevention of traumatic events, that sort of thing, but how do you explore sexual pleasure, enjoyable sex, that sort of thing. It's really, really the involvement in medical training for physicians, NPs, PAs, nurses is very, very minimal, if at all. And that has been demonstrated in multiple publications. And so trying to figure out where these barriers stem from is really critical to addressing the issue. And the biggest things that we found within this publication that you can find online are three main issues. And those are that that educator or the healthcare providers are not educated, so just lack of education, lack of tools. So if we don't have tools and methods for addressing, diagnosing, and figuring out treatment algorithms, then oftentimes we as healthcare providers tend to kind of stay away from them because we don't want to necessarily address something that we can't fix, if that makes sense. We don't want to uncover something that we have no answer for or no awareness of. So it tends to be avoided. And then also just lack of treatment options. So my focus is in female sexual medicine, and especially in that realm. I work in urology, so I see male and female patients walk through our office, but my primary focus is the female population. And in my area of sex medicine, we have extreme very, very few treatment options when it comes to treating sexual pain, sexual issues related to pleasure, such as desire, arousal, and orgasm. So those are the three main barriers from my perspective in my clinical practice.
And when we started out to try to link or understand sexual pleasure as a human right and something that was integral to most people, maybe all people's understanding of health and well-being, not just sexual, but as a critical part of their lives. we thought that it was important to shift the focus beyond that of individuals, which is important and a critical place, especially when working with young people, where we seldom actually trust young people to have pleasure with sex. We don't trust them with their own bodies, which we can talk about later. But one of the key things that I think we were trying to get at with this paper and with the work that we've been doing is linking then these critical individual experiences of people around self-determination, this issue of consent and the affirmation of sex, the sense of one's safety, of security in the space and place where they are, the sense of confidence and comfort to enable sexual experience, and then this ephemeral thing about communication, about what one wants, what one's partner wants, and how that's to be accomplished. All of those things are really critically linked to the foundations of sexual rights as fundamental human rights, sexual citizenship, which you've taken up before, but also I think this idea of sexual justice, that there are actually ways in functional societies for people whose rights have not been achieved to attain those rights. That can be redistributive justice, that can be affirmations of a variety of kinds. Those are the things that we wanted to begin to link together because they all are necessary for sexual health and sexual well-being.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I mean, I feel like it's so important, to set up this conversation, just recognizing that we're not just talking about something that's sort of theoretical, but the implications really have such lasting impact in our bodies and in our experiences and how we manifest. And thank you for bringing a new concept to us, Dennis, of sexual justice. I think that adopting that as a framework is really important. So Melissa and Deanna, you both bring a slightly different perspective into this conversation. Deanna, I understand that when you were the Director of Health and Wellness at the District of Columbia Public Schools, you not only implemented LGBTQ inclusive sex education curriculum, but were specifically seeking sex-positive curriculum to implement in your schools. And Melissa, as a parent and sex educator, you obviously felt compelled to found sex-positive families to help families talk with their children in more sex-positive ways. And so I wanted to hear from you, what your perspectives on and why it's so important for us to talk about sex positivity with young people and its implications of having a sex-positive approach to sex education for young people's development.
I can start. So again, thank you for having me. So yeah, sex positivity is an important element of young people's development, and it's an aspect, again, because sexuality is an aspect of the human experience. And so a lot of what I do when I'm working with parents and caring adults is helping them to understand that sexuality is not something that a person ages into, it's not something that comes with hormones and puberty, but that it is a part of our lifespan. And so when we can look at it from that holistic place and then look at sexual health and all that falls under that umbrella, which is not just about sex, then that can allow parents, caring adults to understand all of the opportunities that are available to foster sexual health and support it from a shame-free lens, which is often, unfortunately, very different than what a lot of adults of today experience firsthand. So it becomes really challenging to recreate something that you didn't experience. But many adults of today have experienced the negative effects of not having a sex-positive upbringing. We have the Me Too movement as an example of something of our current, adult generation. And if we are interested in creating different possibilities, then we need to do something different, take a different approach. And so sex positivity, making sure that young people understand their rights to pleasure, to understanding their bodies, because all of that ties to consent. In order for you to know what doesn't feel good, you have to know what does feel good. And pleasure is something that we can experience, our largest organ being our skin, is something that we can experience at the beginning of our life. And so a lot of what I do is helping to break this down for adults so that they can de-eroticize, their mindset around sex, and really see the role that they can play in influencing a positive view on sex and sexuality and bodies and sexual health for their young person.
Yeah, and hi, I'm Deanna, she, her, hers. Thank you so much for having me on this important panel tonight. In DC, when I was the director of health and wellness for DC public schools, we had a different kind of recognition than maybe some folks in other cities. Like, we live with a generalized HIV epidemic. We're 2 to 3% of the population. I think it was 3% of the population back when we started doing this work. And now it's down to 2%, but it's still a generalized epidemic. So many families in DC have been directly touched by HIV. And what we found was that the parents and caregivers in DC, they know that adolescents have sex, and they really want them to have all the tools that they need in order to be able to make the choices to keep them safe. And so that's what we knew first and foremost when we started going about this work. And then we looked at the public health data, and we know from so many sources of data, including the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, that when young people hide their sexual behavior, they sometimes put themselves at risk. And we didn't want that to happen. We didn't want any of our children to have to hide their sexual behavior. We wanted them to have pleasure with their sexual behavior. We wanted them to decide when and whether to engage in sexual activity. And so we knew that we had a tremendous amount of support from the public health community to focus on a sex ed curriculum that wasn't just a crisis prevention or catastrophe prevention, don't do this curriculum, but that really laid out the instruction and the tools that young people would need to have fantastic relationships. And so what we also had a lot of backing when we were doing this work from the DC Department of Health. They were right there with us in all of our meetings. They were advocating with us. We need better sex ed in our schools. Okay. No, we need it now, Deanna. Okay. And so we took a look at the 3 curricula that we had in place at the different grade levels. And they were all evidence-based interventions. And those are great out in the community, but they don't always work well in the classroom. And so we wanted to actually create a sex ed curriculum that was designed for schools. And we had brand new health learning standards that were sex positive, up to date, included all the things that kids needed, were reflective of the needs of LGBTQ students. And we hired Answer out of Rutgers University, and we said, look, here are our standards. Here's what we know. Here's the will of our community and our leadership. Please design something for us. And so they created a full, I'd say, grade 4 to 12 curriculum for us. And we ran with that for several years. And then a few years ago, we decided to upgrade some more. And when Advocates for Youth came out with their 3 R's curriculum, we jumped at the opportunity to adopt it. And so I worked with the curriculum team to get all the teachers trained and to roll out that new curriculum, which really is sort of the Cadillac version of what we can hope to have in our schools. But it took leadership on behalf of me. It took leadership on the part of our health department, and it took leadership on the part of our schools chancellor to say, this is what our kids need, and we're going to create a curriculum that meets their needs, not our fears.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love knowing that you worked with two of our kind of movement besties, both Answer and Advocates for Youth. And, when you were speaking, Melissa, just the thought that struck me was, I wish that, some of the patients that Brooke sees had that kind of sex positive experience, to help them navigate their own health issues. And then, Dennis, in your paper, you spoke so much about, pleasure being the driver of so much sexual activity. And so to ignore that and to pretend as though that is not part of why we are all engaging in sexual activity really misses the boat and puts, as Deanna was saying, folks at risk who are trying to hide the fact that they're engaging in sexual activity. And so, it's just so important to have all of these things linked. And so I'm just glad that we're doing so right now. So the next question is for both Brooke and Deanna. We're exploring how important it is to have open and informative conversations on sexual pleasure as it relates to sexual health, and how teaching sex education with a sex positive framework contributes to how young people learn about themselves and their bodies. But for Brooke and Deanna, I wanted to get your help in making the connection. Sort of what I just started to do, but between teaching young kids from a sex positive framework and talking to adults about sexual pleasure as a health outcome goal. What should we understand about this relationship between sex positivity and sexual pleasure for individual growth and well-being?
I'll go ahead and start. What I do know is that parents and caregivers are the first sex educators for their kids. And when we think about what Debbie Rothman teaches in the 5-piece suit, that we provide information, affirmation, goal setting, values clarification, and anticipatory guidance, right? And sex ed falls in all of that. And so I think as I've raised my two kids who are now 17 and 19, I was keeping this 5-piece suit in mind. And oftentimes when they would come to me and ask me if toothbrushes were only girls because they didn't have penises, that was, I was like, okay, what are they looking for? And how do I answer those questions? And so a lot of the sex ed that I got growing up, which there wasn't very much of, and then that I learned as an adult working in sexual health, I carried that into my own parenting. And so I know that the better we prepare our students for the world, the better off they'll be prepared to be those sex educators for the young people in their lives, whether they are nieces or nephews or any sort of caregiver relationship that they have with a young person. And then I also know that for our young people who are LGBTQ, I think, again, back to Glissen's work, where we really need to provide our students with both a mirror and a window when it comes to education. And so we really want our LGBTQ students to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. It's a life or death matter for a lot of our young people. And we know from the Family Acceptance Project work that the more we affirm young people when they come out to us, the better off they are. We know that they are healthier and they live healthier lives. And it's a protective measure for us to give them the sex ed that they can see and connect with, that's relevant to their lives, that reflects the experiences that they're having and the decisions that they're making, and that all of that can help them live healthier lives. When I talk to parents, I always try to remind them, like, You know, when you're walking your kid to school and you're telling them about, you know, what they're going to do next during the day, and then you're going to do this, and when you get to school it's going to be like this, and when you come home it's going to be like that. Like, you're not with them when they are making these decisions about their sexual behavior. And so all that wonderful sex positive, pleasure-based, accurate, comprehensive, reflective education, all that you want your children to take into all of those decisions, you know, your time is now to do it. And so the better we prepare our students, the better they're prepared to be parents and to live their lives in a sexually healthy and fun way.
That was fabulous. And that's a perfect segue into kind of my thoughts too. So thank you for that, Deanna. Yeah, so I studied nursing in Norway 20-ish years ago. I'm embarrassed to admit that, but it was fascinating to me because up until that point, you know, I was an undergrad. So I was in my, you know, early 20s or so, or 20, 21. And it absolutely fascinated me how in that region, sex education was started in the early years. So kindergartners were exposed to sexuality education. And so sex wasn't this taboo topic that we see here in the United States. It was just so fascinating. And that stuck with me moving forward. And then I've worked in Ohio, I've worked in Philadelphia, and now I work in Nashville. And just the experience working with people from different communities and different backgrounds has been really eye-opening. So I think it's also important to meet people from or where they are and to kind of gauge what their background was. So that one of the first questions I ask my patients is, tell me how you were first exposed to the concept of sex and sexuality. And that can be a really helpful piece of information in whatever realm you are as a caregiver for an individual, either exploring sexual needs or sexual health issues, or dealing with sexual problems or dysfunctions. And once you have that background, you can kind of work forward and it gives you a lot of information to understand where they're coming from. One of the main things I like to do, regardless of somebody's background, is to destigmatize the word sex, the concept of sexuality, the concept of sexual health. And as Dennis mentioned, you know, the importance of the fact that sex is a fundamental human right. This should not be taboo. So I tell my patients, if they have, let's say, sexual pain, I say, okay, so your pain is in your clitoris or your vagina, and we use proper terms and help patients to understand, or individuals to understand, that it's a body part, just like any other part of your body. Would you be embarrassed to say your nose? Would you be embarrassed to say your elbow? More than likely, no. Kind of an eye-opening conversation for patients to go, oh, okay, you know, I shouldn't be embarrassed of my, you know, my vagina or my vulva or my clitoris or whatever it is that we're talking about. And I also shouldn't be embarrassed to talk about something that everybody more than likely does. It's just a basic aspect of being human. And, you know, so just kind of opening up the conversation in that realm is really helpful. And of course, that transcends into parenting and how we converse with others. So one thing I also try to gauge with my patients is, you know, they often say to me, how did I never hear about this? Why doesn't anybody talk about this? And I say, well, now you have this information, you should consider sharing it if you feel comfortable or if you feel safe with a community of people. So oftentimes women will come back and they'll tell me, you know, oh my gosh, you know, I opened up to my best friend, or I opened up to my, the people at church or the people in my random community. And oftentimes women and individuals of various backgrounds will just come out and say, oh my gosh, I'm dealing with the exact same issue. And so that validates the person that I'm working with, as well as the community in which they participate, whatever their lives may entail. And so I find that to be a really helpful suggestion for my patients that I see, to just communicate. And that also helps to disseminate the information that I'm delivering to my one patient to a broader group of people, as well as children and the younger generations as well. I also encourage my patients to get to know their bodies, you know, in the concept of destigmatizing, explore their bodies. I think it was Melissa that mentioned that, you know, you can't understand what hurts or what's non-pleasurable if you don't understand what is pleasurable. And the same for if you are in a partnered sexual scenario, how could you expect that partner to know what pleases you if you personally don't know what pleases you or what even your body parts are. And so many of the women that I see in my practice oftentimes don't know, you know, where things are, what the terms are, or what the differentiation is in body parts. And it's so, so critical. So I jokingly refer to it as vagina 101. It technically should be vulva or vulvovaginal 101, but I don't want to lose patients. Anyway, it's we joke that, you know, I'm just going to teach you. And as long as they're comfortable, we'll grab a mirror, I'll show them body parts, I'll label them for them and just say, you know, this is your body part. And that really helps them to kind of connect something that's not easily accessible or easily visualized, or maybe that they were told is dirty or they shouldn't look at, they shouldn't touch, and helps to empower them to begin to explore sexual pleasures when they're within a private type of setting. I think I took up enough time, so I'll pass the buck here.
Brooke, I don't know if you know just how, or maybe you do, but I mean, just how transformative it would be to have a healthcare provider say, like, what is your experience with this? And like, let me just speak to you from where you're at so that we can be on this journey together. I mean, I think that there's, you know, kind of whole coalitions and like reams of literature of folks just speaking about how hard it is to access, right, the health information that they want because of the intimidation that they feel with healthcare providers. So, I mean, just from that alone, thank you so much for what you are doing. So let me see, Dennis and Melissa, and this conversation also asserts that sex positivity and sexual pleasure contribute to improving practices of consent, which I think you've talked about a little bit. In your experience of working with individual youth and within public schools, you know, help us understand what these concepts have to do with practice of consent and recognizing also the bodily autonomy of others. And I think that for me, this is where I start to think about, you know, this concept of sexual citizenship, right? And how sex positivity, recognizing sexual pleasure as a driver for sexual activity, facilitate in my mind an opportunity for us to explore sexual citizenship as a mode of civic engagement.
I'll start. So I think it's really important to always center the fact and make sure everyone is aware that consent is not just about sex. Consent is a life skill, and it being a skill meaning it has to be practiced, and it's not just, again, in the context of sexuality or sex and intimate partnerships. And so when people can really understand that, then again, they can see the different opportunities, especially with young people, to help them build the skills for setting boundaries, identifying what boundaries feel right for them, and being able to practice seeing their boundaries being respected. And especially if we're talking about in-home environments, that's where the education really starts. And the education can be, you know, either affirming or supportive of that message around consent, or it can be where people experience their first violations around body boundaries and consent. And again, before it even has anything to do with sex for a lot of people. And so if we really are wanting young people to understand concepts of sex positivity and to be fully expressed in their bodies, to be able to confidently talk with other people about their bodies, and certainly in sexual situations, then we have to make sure that we're providing them with the skills to talk, to give their yeses and their nos and their limits when it comes to everyday scenarios. Things like when they're eating, you know, at the dinner table, and they feel that their body is full. Is a caregiver in their world honoring or respecting that, or are they dismissing that? Are they essentially disconnecting that young person from their own knowing of their body? So being able to talk about feelings and emotions and be able to identify when something doesn't feel safe, or what safety even means to that individual. Again, all outside of sexual context. But so that they can develop those skills so that when it does become about sex, they feel that they have the right to be able to ensure their sense of safety in a situation, that they know what it feels like when someone respects that boundary, and they also can identify when their boundary is not being respected. All of these, again, it all ties into the concepts of consent and permission, and those things happen before it has anything to do with sex.
Yeah, and I'd really like to build on that because I think of sex positivity as this set of intra and interpersonal competencies that we're not born with. We have to learn all of them. They're built on a lot of experiences and role models and training and teaching that we get long before sex becomes a place where we need to use some of those skills. But I think that helps us begin to recognize that sexuality is an asset for ourselves and for others, and that some diversity of that's normal, that's a norm, that's a human experience. And that when people can do that, then I have begun to lean away from the word consent and think about the affirmations that go into sex, because there's so much of, and I've seen so many young people who were in relationships but were coerced or raped within the relationship because it was assumed that consent was blanket within the relationship. And I feel like there are ways to get past that. And I think building on one other thing that Melissa brought up, and I don't wish to go back to a deficit model of adolescent sexuality in any sense. There have been plenty of harms associated with that approach in sex education and in clinical medicine and public health. But I do think we need to be, from a sex positive perspective, respectful of the fact that many people come to their sexual lives with a lot of baggage, with a lot of hurt, with a lot of pain, with a lot of trauma. And that's where I think a particularly mindful, intentional, trauma-informed sex positivity can go a long way to take those people's hands and say, we can work through this, we can get somewhere else, we can help you do that. And I think that's a critical piece of taking sex positivity to a community focus, because it has to recognize that many people have not had positive experiences and have to work through that. I gave a talk to second-year dental students last week, and just talking about how they asked people to open their mouths made a difference in people who had been raped with their mouth when they came to the dentist chair, and how important recognizing that possibility would be, so that they had already avoided triggering a given experience, which isn't rare. So that's the kind of thing that I began helps sex positivity make sense in the way of consent, of affirmation, of making sure that each experience is chosen for whatever the motivations are behind that experience.
Thank you, Dennis. I think you bring in a lot of really important points into this conversation. So I'm realizing that we're already, starting to get close to the point where we want to turn over to Q&A. So I know that Amy just re-upped in the chat box, but if you have questions, there is a Q&A tab, so please feel free to add any of those in your within that tab. So then this I have two more questions that I want to ask the speakers before we turn it over to the audience. And so this is for Deanna and Dennis. So first, Professor Fortenberry, I was struck that your paper specifically argues for a need to address sexual pleasure in our systems, law, policy, advocacy, public health, and clinical practice. And Deanna, you were really light years ahead, I think, in looking for sex-positive curriculum, looking for curriculum that address the needs and lived experiences of, LGBTQ and other young people within a sex ed curriculum. So my question is, it strikes me how those that are opposed to sex education, right, really bring this kind of scare model into their conversations. Oh my God, they're going to teach our kindergartners about pornography or masturbation, and really not recognizing just how important it is for young people to understand their bodies and to be able to know what's going on and to be able to trust their own instincts around these things. And so, my question is, what do you see as being the biggest barriers preventing us from teaching from a sex positive and embracing sexual pleasure as critical for practicing affirmative consent in our systems? And what are your recommendations for how we start to make changes to be able to bring these into the conversations? So basically, I'm asking you how SIECUS does our work better.
I think that's a great question. And honestly, I think the biggest barrier for all of us is adultism. We really, for so many of us, we really don't believe that children are autonomous from us. Certainly when I talk to parents, I see that parents don't think that their children have their own autonomy. So many of us, including educators, don't believe that children are entitled to make decisions and to have a voice in their own lives, or even a voice in their own education, or even a voice in how their school day should be structured. And when we fail to validate and listen to and allow young people to drive their learning and their lives and their experiences, we get in our own way to see them thrive. I really think about my own kids, and even before I talk about my own kids, I think about the work that I did at DC Public Schools. I made sure that everyone on my team was trained in positive youth development. And if you don't know what that is, Google it. It's a framework that we used in anything we did, whether we were talking about bed bugs or HPV or sex ed or teen pregnancy or our transgender guidance. We took every step using a positive youth development framework where our young people were partners with us in their learning. They were partners with us in the planning of programs that impacted their lives, and they were partners in their own decision making. And I think that if you've got that lens, you can let go a little bit and sort of stand separate from the young person and give the young person all that awesome education and skills that you want them to have, and then let them chew on it and practice it. And so the personal story I'll tell you is, in my own personal life, my college sophomore last week texted me a picture of her bathroom mirror in her dorm, and she has posted a little post-it note that says, "When you're sad, call Deanna." And she took a picture of it and she sent it to me. And I'll tell you, anyone who's raised a young person, knows how truly what a gift that was, and what an honor it was to have made that list. But it didn't happen. You don't get to raise a kid to adulthood and have them automatically call you when they're sad. That's a lot of groundwork that was laid, and it was a lot of learning how to let her pick her own clothes when she was 3. It required me to allow her to pick her own food. And so consent starts on the changing table, right? When she didn't want to lay down to be changed anymore, she stood up and she stood on the floor and I changed her. But that took a lot from me to be able to do that and to give her that kind of freedom and choice. And that, you know, those decisions and those choices grew as she grew up, but creating that space, and it requires so many of us adults to set our own expectations aside. I don't even know where we get all these expectations. I mean, I read Romeo and Juliet in high school. Kids were having sex at least back when Shakespeare was alive, and I suspect they're having sex before then. And so, like, I don't exactly understand completely where these expectations come from, but we've got to set our expectations aside and really allow people, the young people that we are with, that we're teaching, that we're raising, to have their own experiences and to give them all of that we want them to have, and then, like, let them go practice. And then when they, you know, when the practicing turns good or bad, that we're here. And if it's bad and they're sad, they call us. And so I think that's really sort of, you know, maybe I'm like, okay, success, goal, met.
Yeah, and I think that, to me, that's where it comes down to this idea of trusting young people to be able to discover, to learn, and to come into ownership of their own bodies, which they have for themselves. And I think our jobs as adults is to respect that and provide the guidance that is useful. But what really works is trusting them to be able to not be an unexploded bomb in terms of their own sexuality, that they're just going to mess it up, because by and large they won't, with the right space and the right time and the right support. And I agree with this adultism thing. I think many adults romanticize adolescent sexuality so intensely. In fact, the rule if you come to meet me in my office, I say there are dirty words in my office, and one of them is virgin. And if you're talking virgin, you better be talking old growth forests or really good olive oil, because a person's sexual status is unimportant in any of the conversations we need to be having about young people, unless they're telling you the story themselves. And that's what matters.
No, thank you so much. I just, you know, as a parent of young little ones, and who are male-bodied, and you know, and I feel so fortunate because I have twins, and getting to see them both exploring, you know, their own bodies and desires and needs and all of, and just, you know, coming to express themselves. It just reaffirms exactly what we were saying. You know, we have to follow our kids and recognize that they are the ones who are, you know, know best, you know, what they need. And so I appreciate very much what you were saying, Deanna. And Dennis, I just feel like your work with young people has just been so touching for those that you have worked with. So I appreciate very much the experience that you're bringing into this conversation. My last question before I turn it over to our audience is for Brooke and Melissa. Brooke, I was struck at how much your practice focuses on helping women overcome such misinformation and social stigma to address their sexual health care needs. And then that, Melissa, you're working, you know, to provide this individual and community-based support for parents, families, for children to have a better sexual health future. And yet it's not surprising that so many people have such a hard time practicing consent when there's such silence around the topic of sex. What do you wish that people knew or understood about sex positivity or sexual health or consent in terms of the folks that you work with and who, you know, you see in your practices?
I guess I unmuted first, so I'll go first. The thing that we keep hearing from multiple experts here on this panel is that, again, sexuality is a fundamental human right. It's something that's very basic to being a human. And I've noticed, I peeked at a couple of the Q&A questions, and there were a couple comments about, what about asexuality in individuals that identify as aromantic? So essentially individuals that don't derive sexual pleasure or don't have romantic thoughts or sexual feelings, that sort of thing. And that's part of sex being a fundamental human right. That's encompassed within that. And that also kind of opens my thought process to individuals, let's say in the BDSM community. So that's another area that I tend to work quite a bit in. I have a lot of individuals that are involved in, BDSM of whatever that might look like. And so individuals derive sexual satisfaction in multiple varied ways. And as long as it's not harming them, harming others, negatively impacting their daily functioning, it's not necessarily something that is problematic. And in fact, it's very natural and very healthy. So again, that whole destigmatizing what healthy sexuality should look like, I think is really, really important. And anybody that's working with an individual in the sexual realm, whatever, again, that may be, I think it is important to, as Dennis was saying, kind of throw away the underlying vision that we as individuals bring to the table, but rather just keep an open mind, both from the provider or counselor or wherever we're coming, educator, as well as from the individual receiving the information. I think it's really important to keep an open mind and understand that there's not a one size fits all when it comes to human sexuality. There's a wide array, there's a spectrum of what that looks like. So that I think is a really important fact when we're basically in this conversation.
Yes, and building on that, and also piggybacking on what Dennis mentioned earlier, that it's just so important that we remember that there are so many varied experiences that people have had, and they have not all been safe, consensual, or positive. And again, they don't all correlate directly with just sex and sexual scenarios, that there are consent violations, body boundaries that people experience violated from a very young age. And all of those can impact the building blocks, the foundations, and an individual's understanding or inability to be able to open up their understanding to these concepts around sexual health and sex positivity and consent. So if we're making assumptions about what this all means to other people, and I think especially, sometimes as educators, we have so much knowledge, or as providers, we have so much knowledge that we're just like eager and hungry to share and to impart upon others, or to help others feel liberation. But we have to start where people are at, like Brooke mentioned. And in order to do that, we want to make sure, especially as we're developing curricula or facilitating spaces, that we are opening up space for people to be able to explore their own experience, their own connection to these concepts, as opposed to just laying down, these definitions or the research or all of this evidence that we have that things should look a certain way. And so a lot of the work that I do, again, is a little more grassrootsy, and is more, and I use social media as a place, because one thing I noticed as I taught sex ed in classrooms was that, I could create the best place for a young person to be able to share and talk about these concepts and explore these concepts. But if they couldn't even go home and talk about this at the dinner table, this was that thing about their day that they leave out because they were already aware of a closed off or possibly sex negative or unsafe environment, in some cases in their own home, then we're doing a disservice. So we have to make sure that we're thinking about how we're involving families, how we're involving communities, how we're involving parents into the conversation of young people and serving youth and sexual health, because that school is not the only place, and especially these days, you know, we're all finding ourselves having to get really creative about what school looks like, and families are finding themselves at home with their young people, and so it isn't just something that, you know, we can delegate out when it comes to talking about these concepts. And so helping to create spaces where grown-ups, adults, caregivers, parents have the opportunity to explore what their own relationship to consent and sexual health and sex positivity and safety have meant for them, because they'll continue potentially to have avoidance around these topics if there's not a space for them to find healing, find support, find resources that feel accessible and attainable for them to come to their own sense of understanding, so that they can feel more confident to be able to talk about these topics with the young people in their lives.
Thank you so much. So I've just been spending a little bit of time going through the Q&A. We have so many amazing questions, and I know that we're not going to get through all of them, but I'm really grateful to the audience for, you know, bringing in some really just comprehensive and robust ideas. I think I wanted to start, let me go up. There was one that just started, you know, you know, talking about young kids. So I actually want to combine two of them, because Jazz Alexis Ladeo, sorry if I butchered your name, talks about where does the boundary exist for parents respecting children's boundaries and then stepping in for safety reasons, but also from Jessica Taylor, you know, is asking, when she tries to advocate for sex education, there's always this question of at what age is it okay to explore sexual pleasure? We know that from an early age, these feelings are developing. Is it according to the child, or is there research that helps us understand when this is best? And this is for
I can talk about the research, because there isn't any, about when in a developmental continuum pleasure really takes on meaning as sexual. That doesn't mean that parts of your body that we identify as sexual don't feel good when they're touched. They do. Mm-hmm. Probably from the time well before we're born. But when those feelings become explicitly sexual and identified as sexual, pleasant, and associated with certain kinds of behaviors, that's not well described, and there's not a real body of literature that helps you do that. In fact, I think probably all of us have talked to lots and lots of young people whose narratives around their early sexual experiences did not include pleasure at all. Many do, for sure, but certainly lots and lots of people don't. And I think that's because pleasure is developmental as well, and part of it's learned. It's not a great answer because there's not a lot to guide the answer.
I'd like to share some thoughts in terms of kind of the developmental element. So something that I help deconstruct for parents is around pleasure, and again, in a non-sexual, erotic, non-adult, eroticized context, are the feelings that we can experience. Pleasure can be experienced through it can be experienced through art. It can be experienced through, you know, standing outside and feeling the breeze, you know, on your body and bringing joy. There's a connection between your feelings, your inner knowing, and we're born with those things, right? With that connection to our own body. And so finding the ways that we can help young people at very, very early ages express what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, what essentially pleasure or displeasure looks like for them. And it's also important that parents are and caring adults are considering what it looks like for themselves, because as they model, they ultimately are modeling their own relationship and connection to their body, to their feelings, to their abilities or challenges around expressing their feelings and emotional regulation, and their ability to prioritize their own pleasure. And that is definitely a challenging topic right now with the pandemic and folks in many people, families experiencing more enclosed spaces together. And so that points back to boundaries, that points back to consent, that points back to some self-advocacy. And so parents really getting clear about what that looks like for themselves, and knowing that it's a journey, that there's not like this, you know, I'm sex positive, or I'm the ultimate level of sexual health, I've won that badge and I'm done. It's a lifelong journey. And so in that are many opportunities. And then if you're mentoring young people, seeing those things pre-adult eroticism, and really just about a connection to your body and a trust that you have the chance to maintain with your body. And parents finding their position as not being gatekeepers to continuing to have that relationship with one's own body.
Can I add to this conversation? Also looking at something else that came up in the Q&A about data for teaching sex ed at really young ages. And I think that sometimes folks who sort of straddle the world of health education and public health sometimes can conflate the two, and we get really caught up in trying to see sort of health outcomes immediately from our health education. And I mean, everyone that's taken world history and then later on went on to run a country and start a war, like they all should have failed, right? Then that's like, no, did not meet expectations. You did not learn from world history. And so I think that in the similar way, health education year after year, it grows upon itself, and it helps to create children and tweens and teens and adults who are able to take responsibility and take action to establish boundaries, demand consent, engage in healthy relationships, put awesome stuff in your body, like all the things, you know, engage in physical activity, all the things that we want to see people learn and learn how to practice in health education. We want to see that in sex education too. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, you know, not only says that health education should happen at school, but they actually believe that sex ed needs to happen across the landscape of adult professionals that engage with young people. And in fact, the AAP actually recommends that pediatricians talk about sex ed with their patients. Pediatricians who are only given 10 minutes with a patient. Sex ed is so important that it needs to be prioritized in that 10-minute once a year visit. So it's not necessarily health outcomes that we're trying to measure at all times, but just building this richness of information, knowledge, being able to identify feelings and being able to implement skills is what we're seeking.
Yeah, exactly. I would also just point folks to the national sex ed standards that have been recently revised, where, you know, we really tried to, yeah, we're so glad, you know, identify some of the kind of skill building markers starting from kindergarten and going through school. But I mean, it's exactly this lifelong kind of learning process. So it's 8:15 already, so I want to try to get through as many questions as possible. I just want to give folks presenters another opportunity to respond to speaking about asexuality and recognizing sexual well-being being a human experience, and that there are young people who identify as asexual who may not connect with that phrasing, language, or framework. So how do we include asexual folks within this conversation? And then Dennis, specifically for you, there were a couple of questions about, could you expand more on getting beyond the word consent? What would you envision that looking like differently? And then there was another question about the deficit framework of sex education and, what you're referring to when you mentioned that. I'm going to stop there and let you guys start to respond.
Well, the deficit model is one that may be my personal experience because I'm old and was educated sometime in the last century, where everything that we were taught in medical school and in the early years of my practice in adolescent medicine was around the bad things that happen when adolescents have sex. They get pregnant, they get sexually transmitted infections. As HIV came into the world, there was a time where a common public health message was that the uncontrolled sexual behavior of young people would destroy the next generation because they would be infected with HIV. And we've heard some of those parables repeated with COVID. We're hearing them now. Young people are the crux of the epidemic. And all of the elements of truth to that lead you away from the fact that these are young people doing things that are healthy and hopeful for all of us. They are doing things that we want them to do in many ways. That's the way I was taught. That was the baggage I had to overcome in order to go to a place where I recognized that HIV was a thing and an important thing, but it wasn't the only thing, and not even the most important thing. And there was something else, but now I've forgotten. That's the other part about being old. Short-term memory.
I think that when we're talking about young people who are asexual or just aren't experiencing sort of, what is being displayed on television or talked about or glamorized, it's important to create space for them to have their own experiences. And with the asexual young people that I've worked with, it's about like this is sort of a range and you are within the normal range. And we have, again, being able to own and have agency over our own sexuality means that young people are allowed to be asexual and aromantic, and young people are allowed to, be have lots of feelings and desires, and that these are all within the range of normal, and that the best thing to do is find what works for you, find that space that works for you, and don't get caught up again talking about somebody. I saw somewhere in there about social norms, and certainly sort of it's important in curriculum to make sure that you're giving young people the information and the data that helps to sort of give them some perspective. I think it's since the dawn of time, every teenager has thought that everyone's having sex except for them, and since the dawn of time that has not been true. And so wherever you are in good company. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Brooke, I don't know if you want to respond further on the question about asexual and trans individuals. There was a question here specifically for you about how the experience of exploring and identifying body parts might be like for a transgender client as an intervention to mitigate dysphoria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you know, I think that every individual, so this always comes up. Women come to me all the time and say, something's wrong with me. I look weird, I don't look normal, because unfortunately, in, you know, porn and other sorts of outlets, individuals are portrayed, women are supposed to look a certain way, men are supposed to look a certain way. And if you don't look like that, there's something wrong with you. So I spend a lot of time just basically educating my patients that there is no, well, I don't want to say there's no right or wrong, because certainly there are medical variations that warrant intervention. I'm not going to say that. But there's a wide variety of how people look. And so I try to explain that to my patients to start out with, and say, when I examine them, assuming I find no medical concerns that warrant intervention, I basically explain to them, you look normal and healthy, or you appear normal and healthy. And that's how I would describe anybody, even a trans individual maybe that has been through surgical intervention. And so then just exploring that individual's body parts, you know, and getting comfortable with wherever they are in their, you know, if they're in transition or whatnot, I think is so critical, just like anybody that I would see in my practice. And I was actually also answering some questions too about individuals with disabilities. And I'm not sure if the question was relating to physical or intellectual. My area of focus is primarily intellectual, but oftentimes that population is considered or deemed asexual or aromantic, and that could not be further from the truth. You know, whether we're talking about developmental and intellectual disabilities or physical, everybody has the capability of feeling sexual urges. And so I think that it's really important for everyone to never assume that somebody doesn't want romantic relationships or sexuality, or to explore their body, or that they don't feel arousal. And taking away sexuality education from somebody simply because of your preconceived notion that that maybe they don't have that capability of feeling that, could be really detrimental, not to just their future ability to derive sexual pleasure, but also to put them in harm's way for not understanding the concepts of consents and basic social boundaries.
Thank you. So there are a couple of different questions, and I'm going to just like kind of paraphrase them about how do we bring all of these concepts and ideas into schools. That there are educators that are trying to do this, they are, you know, pushing their schools to do this and meeting resistance. You know, so how do they take the steps to, you know, bring these ideas, these concepts, these practices into their own areas where they're working?
I mean, I can start with that. You know, it's so much easier to teach OWL at Vacation Bible School at my church than it is to teach sex ed in a public school. And so I think that that's such an excellent question. There's so much more that I can cover when I teach OWL at church than our teachers teach at school, even though they've got great curriculum. And so I think from what I did was I followed all the rules. And so we just had our new health education standards. And so I pulled those standards. We went line by line. Many of us, you know, many folks on my team and across the city had even worked on those standards. And then we, you know, really sort of tried to see if we could find curriculum that met all of those standards. We ended up, like I said, hiring Answer to do it. But I think now there are a lot of other curriculum that are out there. And this kind of also answers the question of like, how do you teach this outside of school? I saw somebody worked with young people who have survived sexual assault. Some of these curriculums are available for free. The Flash curriculum out of Seattle King County is up on the website. You just have to Google it. And then the Advocates for Youth 3R's curriculum also is available on the website. They're free. And so we used actually the 3R's curriculum, not only to teach sex ed in school by following our standards and getting the support of the leadership within our school district. And we were a school district that had mayoral control, so we didn't have to go through a school board, but we did have a leadership team and a chancellor who needed to buy into all of this. But then we also used a lot of some of the lessons in the 3Rs curriculum we did a big Title IX redesign in our school district around sexual assault. And we pulled out sort of what were those necessary training components for our staff, for our principals, for our students when it came to consent and sexual assault. And we actually lifted out pieces from the 3Rs curriculum that we thought were appropriate for talking about consent and sexual assault outside of health class. So that, you know, these are available to just pull up and use. And because they're available and they're all available, you know, when you get to the place where you have leadership support within your school district, then you can pull the lessons that you can use that align with the standards that you have. And you might, I saw somebody in there talking about Title IX already. And Title IX, I think, continues to be a source of support for us as we work to advocate for sex ed that's inclusive for our queer and trans kids, along with all the genders that we have in school.
We have, I don't know if anybody else wants to respond to that question. We have a few more minutes left. There are kind of two questions, and again, I'm going to try to paraphrase because there's a lot of really great commentary happening in the Q&A. But there's sort of a thread of questions of, you know, suggestions for resources or where folks can direct young people who have, who, you know, would need, you know, accessible, affirmative, sex positive information for themselves, just, you know, generally, but then also specifically as it relates to understanding porn, BDSM, and kink. And then there's a really thoughtful question, I think from Jessica, which is the first one that was brought in that I'd love to, you know, get some responses to, which is, you know, how do we talk to young people today about the non-consensual hysterectomies that are happening in detention centers right now? And, you know, for me, I think that, you know, this is very similar and along the lines of the kinds of conversations that parents are having to have around police brutality and violence. And so I think it's a really timely question for us to be asking ourselves.
I can start first in terms of resources for young people. Scarleteen.com is a go-to. Heather Corinna, who is the creator of Scarleteen, also has two really excellent books for young people. One is called Sex, the All You Need to Know Guide to Get You Through Your Teens and 20s. And the other one is called Wait What, a comic book guide to, I think it's like relationships growing up. It's a cool comic book, and that one is really great for, that you can also integrate into curricula. Let's see if I have it right here. Really great for this one, Wait What is her latest. And this one's really good. It has a lot of great activities that can be done with young people. But Scarleteen, also Amaze, we talked about Amaze. So amaze.org, which also has resources for younger ages. There's also, and for parents, there's also a 6-Minute Sex Ed podcast. That podcast was created by Kim Cavell, a sex educator out of Chicago, who has created these 6 to 8 minute long podcasts that can be listened to by the whole family. There are level 1 episodes for the younger ages and level 2 episodes for teens, for tweens and teens. And so those are great resources that can that they can, you know, completely look up on their own, sexetcetera.org. So lots of really, really great options these days compared to, you know, what a lot of us probably grew up with. And then in terms of talking with young people about really any events that are, you know, going on that are challenging, that are difficult to talk about. I think first, as adults, as caregivers, it's important to assess where you are at on these topics. You know, what is coming up for you? Are there any misinformation, any biases, any triggers that are coming up for you? Because all of that can also affect how confident you feel talking about it, how prepared you feel talking about it, what your nonverbal cues or body language are when you are talking about these topics or when they get brought up. And then, certainly your approach would be different with a very young child, versus an older child. When we talk about teens or tweens, you can, the likelihood is higher that maybe they're on social media, maybe they're hearing about these things or seeing these things. So gauging what they think about it. Have they heard about this? So you can initiate the conversations around that, and also kind of engage them in what their sense of social responsibility or their sense of responsibility may be around these topics. Whereas with younger people, drawing out some of the other themes. So, when it comes to reproductive justice and what people can do with their, what other people have the rights to when it comes to their bodies, finding the themes that, can help a younger child connect the dots around consent or around safety. So yeah.
And don't forget to talk about things that are also relevant to younger people, like kissing, like dancing, like moving to music. Those are all things that adults forget are sexually intense for many young people and much more likely to be part of their experience than adults' images of what their teens are doing.
Oh, thank you all so much. We are basically at time. I tried my best to get through as many questions as possible. And I'm so appreciative to everyone in this audience who, have stuck with us, who are asking these really thoughtful questions, who are, just kind of recognizing this moment that we're in and being on this journey with us. Antoinette asked a question earlier that's, where's the grassroots movement for this? And yes, please join us. This is the charge that we have, because there's just so much that is at risk and is vital for, how we not only understand ourselves and our own bodies, but also, how we understand how to relate to other people and to recognize and value and affirm, each other's experiences. So I'm so grateful to all of you. I feel like we just skimmed the surface, but hopefully you got enough nuggets of information and thought to explore further. I'm going to do my best to make sure that we can save everything, to respond to things as we're able to. And this recording will be shared with all of the registrants for this event. So thank you all so much. I am so grateful to you, Dennis, Deanna, Brooke, Melissa, for sharing your time and your insights with us, and for your generosity of being here with us during this just incredibly bizarre and traumatizing time. Thank you to everyone from around the world and in the country who are grappling with acts of God and are still with us. Be safe, be well, and have a great and wonderful evening. So thank you.